Morning, everyone. Hope you're well. This is the Best in Property podcast with Paul Smith today. Paul is the MD of Strategic Land Group based in Manchester. Paul talks about his journey today on, I guess his previous days working for one of the big national house builders. I was excited to have a conversation with Paul because he talks about the key differences between brownfield and greenbelt, and I guess the length of the applications that are needed to go into these size of projects. It's not just a case of 1 or 2 years, it could be 3 to 5 years. So it was interesting to hear his points on, I guess, what the council need to do for the housing shortage that we have in Manchester at the moment. And it's a podcast which I'm sure you'll enjoy. So have a great day.
Hello and welcome to the Best in Property podcast with Jake Notman. The podcast where you get to access the best property leaders around the world. From the biggest developers in the UK to the largest property investors across the globe. We pick the brains and answer the questions you've always wanted to ask. Enjoy.
Paul, thank you very much for coming on the Best in Property podcast. How is everything doing your side?
Yeah, I'm doing okay, thanks, Jake. It's an interesting time at the minute, isn't it, to say the least? But we're doing all right. I'm getting into the groove of working from home, and if I'm honest, just regretting never having gotten around to redecorating the spare room since we moved into this house, because it's got bright red walls, and I sit staring at them all day, and just think, even just magnolia would have been fine. But yeah, other than that, I'm doing all right.
Good man. Yeah, I think it's interesting is the word, like you said. I think it's a bit of a peculiar time, really. I think it is uncertain. I think no one really knows. I mean, it's unfortunate for many, and I guess sat in the positions we are for, I think, like I said, I guess it makes you realise sort of what you're grateful for in life in terms of sort of spending time with family and, like you said, getting sort of the boring sort of home jobs done when you need to. So, yeah, I guess there is some positives in many ways, but it's not a great situation for many. So, how's everything with business-wise? Obviously, a lot, I guess, has changed in terms of how you guys operate. What sort of things have you had to put in place sort of day to day?
I think we're quite lucky in many ways because the nature of the projects that we do, they're sort of very, very long term. It's not uncommon for us to be working on a planning project for 5, 6, 7 years. It's the impact, of a 7 weeks are we into a lockdown now isn't, on a time scale of that length, isn't dramatic. So we've had, day to day, we've always been pretty well set up to work remotely, to be honest, because we're out and about quite a lot. So starting to work from home wasn't all that disruptive. It was just, literally the announcement came on a Monday evening, I think, didn't it? And I had my laptop and my phone with me. So I went back into the office once to get some envelopes and paper clips and a stapler. And that was pretty much it. The harder bit has been with the projects, I guess, because we're working with local authorities so much and they've had their own challenges trying to work out how they can keep the planning system going with all the constraints and restrictions that we've had in place. And some of that has required legal changes. The great example of that, I guess, is planning committees, where it was actually unlawful to have a remote planning committee until the coronavirus bill came into force.
For sure. I was going to ask you on that, Paul, about the sort of the virtual sort of planning and the committees and all that going on. What's your personal opinion on that, really? Do you think there's going to be any changes for when things do get back to normal for the future of sort of virtual committees, really?
I would hope there are, because I think it's an area where the planning system can do a lot better. Because the whole point of planning committee is that decisions are taken in public view, and that members of the public have the opportunity to turn up and participate. And when the only way of doing that is to be at the town hall at 6:30 p.m. on a Tuesday evening or whatever it might be, that's actually quite restrictive for a lot of people. And, if you're somebody like me that's got a young family, that might not be convenient because 6:30 p.m. is bath time, actually. So there's no way I'm ever going to go to a planning committee meeting at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And there are plenty of people in a similar situation that work shift patterns that aren't conducive to it. Sort of digital committee meetings where members of the public can log on and participate remotely from wherever they are, I think will be a huge advantage. And even in terms of, the makeup of councillors, that it tends to be that, and I mean, got to be careful when you start generalising, haven't you? Because local councillors tend to be older people because they tend to have the time to turn up to meetings like that. But again, if you can do it remotely, maybe you start to get a younger age profile of local councillor too, and with sort of a more broad-based public involvement and a slightly different profile of local councillor, maybe some of those people that are actually supportive of development might have their voice heard more, rather than the sort of the vocal minority that tends to be the people that turn up and speak at the moment.
It's a good point, actually. I think you definitely give that different opinion, don't you? I think if you are getting that younger generation, it gives that access to people, I guess, like I said, at the younger generation that can, see the future in, I guess, a slightly different way to the older generation, I guess, in many ways. So that's a great point, that, actually. I think there will be some changes over the next sort of 12 to 18 months, and hopefully they recognise it for a positive change rather than sort of taking a step back. So, but I'm sure we'll progress forward, which is always nice. But Paul, I wanted to take you back sort of on your journey before, obviously, SLG, and obviously the time that you had at Taylor Wimpey. I mean, obviously you progressed into sort of the land and sort of planning director. How was that working for one of sort of the big house builders, and sort of what sort of things did you learn on your journey that you've obviously implemented into your current business?
It was a great starting point for me, actually. It was my first job from university where I joined. It was George Wimpey, as it then was, on there, and I think it was the second intake of their graduate training scheme at the time. And the way they operated that training program, there were 8 of us across the whole UK business, and you got rotated through different offices and different departments. So it wasn't that I joined saying I want to work in a land team. I just joined saying, like lots of graduate schemes, I want to be a management trainee. But I worked in, right across the business, from finance to customer care, the commercial side, land. I even had a month working out on site, shadowing a site manager, which was in Edinburgh in December. So it was just in the shadows of the Queensferry Bridge there, and I'd tell you what, it was cold. So getting that sort of broad grounding was really helpful to actually start to see how all those individual components of the development business fit together. And then moving around different business units was really helpful too, because house builders, you think of them as sort of big monolithic PLCs, but each of those offices tends to have a very different culture, depending on the character and personality of the MD there. And they've all got different ways of doing things. And at the time, actually, at Wimpey, it had so many mergers and acquisitions that some of the offices were, almost still working as though they were the old house builder business that Wimpey had taken over. Mm-hmm. So it was a very broad and fast introduction to house building, I think, that, would take you a long time to get if you were just working in one office doing the same job day after day after day. It's a bit like, I don't know if you're into cricket, Jake, but I'm a huge cricket fan. And there's a brilliant quote from Shane Warne when he was asked about the legendary Australian spinner Shane Warne, and he was asked about the England bowler Monty Panesar, who Panesar looked like he was going to be brilliant when he started playing for England, but then somehow he just didn't seem to get any better. And somebody said to Warne, why is it that after 20 Test matches, Monty Panesar isn't any better? After all this experience, why isn't Monty Panesar any better a player than he was when he started? Mm-hmm. And one said, well, it's because he hasn't played 20 Test matches. He's played the same Test match 20 times. He's just repeated that same bit of experience time and time and time again, rather than sort of developing and moving on. And it's a bit like that, I suppose. You got, instead of having 2 years experience by the time I settled into a land department, I'd had, lots of experience in lots of different departments, and you just accelerate through that learning curve, don't you?
For sure. Is that, in terms of people starting out in property, would you say, Paul? I think it's many people in the sector, when they come into property, obviously they come to the industry for many reasons, but I think as a a young lad in many ways. A lot of them go for, well, they're drawn for the money reasons. They're drawn for what property can give you for the future. But do you recommend a lot of people get into the businesses and try and look at different roles? I guess a lot of people can sit on the fence saying, well, you're not becoming a master of any of those trades. But I guess, would you recommend people starting out to learn as much as they can in various different roles?
I think that's really important, yes, because I think the property industry is quite funny, actually, in that it's quite segmented between the different disciplines. And if you think about, what the property, the cradle to grave, as it were, of a property project, you start out with, at the front end, with land acquisition, and you finish up at the back end with sales and lettings. But if you think about how that journey in between often gets sliced up between lots of different organisations, lots of different companies in some cases, and certainly lots of different departments within businesses, that if you're not careful, you can end up becoming an expert in a really narrow element of it without seeing how you fit into the broader picture. And I don't think it's a case of, being a jack of all trades, master of none, but I think it's really important that you've got an understanding of the entire journey so that you can be making decisions mindful of that. And one of the points that I always make with Strategic Land Group and the projects that we are working on is, our business, Jake, is designed to try and get planning permission on a development site and sell it to a developer.
Yeah.
And there are lots of land promoters out there. But sometimes when your background is just in planning, there can be a perception or a temptation to think that getting planning permission is the end result. And don't get me wrong, getting planning is incredibly difficult. But it is actually only a step on the journey. The end result is, with any property project, is to sell something or to build something. And you've got to know what that end game is to make sure that the planning permission you get is a step in the right direction. Because it is just a step to that end result. It's a really important one, but it is just a step. And if you're not aware of all the considerations around selling or building that development when you've finished, you might not quite get the right planning permission. That's just one example. But I think, having that awareness of the whole business, the whole breadth of the business, really, and the beginning and how projects operate beginning to end, actually makes your bit, or makes you better at delivering your bit of that process.
I couldn't agree more. I think what I've tried to do personally myself is understand all the roles, because within a property development, for example, there is the architects, there is the QSs, there is the highway consultants. There's a lot of people that essentially you've got to get on with, and you've got to understand as much as you can about what they do. Of course, you've got your set thing that you do, but I think, like you said, it makes your life so much easier, and it makes it what allows you to have a better relationship with the professionals that you're working with if you actually understand a little bit about what they do. I guess it makes it a lot easier. I mean, something you talk about, obviously, which is planning applications and getting consent, is it's never an easy process, as you know more than anyone, Paul. I mean, it is complex. I mean, and of course, there is, with any planning permission, I think, like you said, it's just a start, really, getting consent. You've got the list of conditions that obviously you've got to work with. You've got the councils, you've got all the highways, you've got everything to sort out, really. What advice would you give to someone? I mean, if they've got a piece of land and they don't really know much about planning, is it straight away go to a planning consultant? Is it straight away go to a company like yourselves? Or how would you go about someone who's got a piece of land, who wants to put an application through, but literally has no idea, I guess, what to do, really?
I think you've got, the planning system is so incredibly complex as well, and I think it's really difficult now for people without knowledge and experience of the system to sort of navigate it properly. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when a planning application was a bundle of drawings, an application form, a check, and a rubber band to hold it all together. But it's a little bit more involved than that now. So I think, the starting point should always be to go and get some advice from somebody. And I think the important thing with who you go to for that is that it's somebody that, yes, has the knowledge of the system, but that you trust. And that's the most important part. Because there are so many different ways of doing it, from, instructing a planning consultant yourself, and having them run the project, and they'll be able to coordinate all the supporting consultants for you. There are some challenges with that because it can be very expensive, and some planning consultants are better than others at keeping their eyes on the prize of that end result of building or selling something. You can go straight to a house builder, and certainly sites where the planning risk is low, and house builders can reasonably accurately determine what they can pay for a site up front. That's often a good route. I think where land promoters like ourselves have a role are on those sites where there is maybe a little bit more planning risk. Possibility of a permission is somewhat lower, and as a consequence of that, house builders would often try and effectively negotiate a discount to reflect the risk they're taking. And that's where we can perform a really good role by securing a permission before the site is sold, so that it's being sold with all that planning risk removed. But I think, as I said, the key thing is you do need to go and get some advice, because it is just, I'm reading planning documents and appeal decisions and court judgments virtually every day. And I'm learning new stuff about the intricacies and the nuances of the planning system every day. So I think, the key thing is make sure you go and get some advice from somebody that knows what they're doing.
For sure. I think that, I think space changes, everything's changing all the time with planning as well. And I think with so much going on, there's just so many ways. Doing a property development, as you know, is a commercial decision. It's a business opportunity. The plan is to make a profit. And there's just so many ways that I guess planning can affect that in many ways. And if you don't know what you're talking about, then I guess you're going to leave a lot of money on the table, really. But something which I'm always interested in, I look at myself personally as a developer, as well as working within the underwriting and sort of the exit side of things for developers, is identifying opportunities. We work with a host of different platforms such as Land Insight, various different sort of sources, architects, planning consultants. What do you guys do internally from your side to find the right sites? And is it a case of sources? Is it a case of finding the right software? And what would you recommend for someone looking to find the best sites?
I'm not telling you that. No. No, a bit like you, really. You've got to try and use as many different sources as possible, don't you? So, yes, there are agents that we know really well that we keep in touch with and make sure we're on their marketing lists, so that we're getting sites that they hear off from the clients. We actually get quite a lot of sites introduced direct from members of the public, and we get probably something like a site a day sent into us through the website. And a lot of those, don't have much potential, but some of them do. And this game is panning for gold, isn't it, to a degree? Mm-hmm. But probably the main source of sites for us, and the source of the best sites, are ones that we just find ourselves. That we sit down with a local authority proposals map, usually Google Earth, a few other free online mapping packages like the Environment Agency's flood risk maps and that sort of thing. And just eyeball the map to try and see where something might be suitable. And being mindful always of, having read the planning policies and trying to understand what they say, because, a big part of the skill in what we're doing is we're not really looking for sites that we can get planning permission on right now. Ideally, we're looking for sites where we think planning policies are going to change, which would mean a site like that would be considered to be suitable. So it's trying to sort of forward predict which councils are going to change local plan policies and when, and to see, to try and estimate what direction that change might be in. So that's the main source, probably just finding them ourselves and writing to the landowners and saying, can we come and have a chat?
For sure. It is very complex, and there is a lot of documentation that comes with, obviously, a plan application and understanding development frameworks. How much, as a percentage, would you say your time is spent reading these documents? Is it a case of every morning? Is it a case of you sort of find the time each day, or is it just as and when sort of you're looking at sites, and is it all the time that you're looking at these planning docs?
When we're trying to identify new sites, we start off by picking a target borough, and then we'll do sort of quite a deep dive into the documents, because usually for us the answers are in the evidence base that sits below the local plan rather than in the local plan itself. because that gives you an idea as to what the actual underlying trends are, and therefore when things might change. And that can take, you can spend the whole day doing that on one local authority. But other than that, once we've secured a site, it's like lots of things, isn't it? You read the documents, you absorb that knowledge, and then, you might need to flip back and just refresh your memory because you've got a vague recollection that there was a particular policy trying to do a particular thing. But it's not a huge amount of time because you start absorbing and getting used to, what they say. So it's just keeping on top of it, really. And for us, one of the most powerful things we can do is to track the changes between the various iterations of the document. So when you've been following a local plan from its inception, from the very first issues and options stage, right the way through to the version that's submitted to the council, it's usually in those changes where the changes in the various drafts of the document where the opportunities start to arise, where you can see that, hang on a minute, why have they changed that? That doesn't make sense. A good example of that is Bradford Council, where they have a local plan with a housing target and a jobs growth target in it. And then because of a change in government policy, they realised they could reduce their housing target. So they did that, or they're trying to do that, but they didn't change the jobs growth target. And the two were actually symbiotic. The original housing target had been arrived at because they'd said, if we want this many jobs, this is how many homes we're going to need to house that workforce.
Mm-hmm.
And then they've just reduced the housing target because of a change in policy. So it's looking at that and saying, well, hang on a minute, that just can't be right, can it? Because if that number of homes was needed to deliver that many jobs, and you've now got fewer homes, you either need to reduce your jobs target so that the two are in balance again, or increase your housing target back up to where it was so the two are in balance again. You can't have the two halves of the plan trying to achieve different objectives. But it's those sorts of changes that you might not have spotted that had they been consistent with it right the way through. It was only in the change being introduced that you realise there's something not quite right there.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely, you got to keep on top of the information that's being put out there, haven't you, really? I think it's like you said, you've got to keep ahead of the curve because, and it's interesting to hear what you say about Bradford because it's, things are changing. If you don't keep on top of it, then you're losing out a lot of business in many ways. But something which I'm personally interested in, Paul, is, of course, we come across as a business ourselves a lot of big pieces of land and probably wouldn't work for us in terms of being a project because we're just not at that size yet. It's obviously probably typically more suitable for a house builder. But in terms of obviously making a regeneration project, taking a large piece of land almost to like a mini village, almost small town in many ways, what sort of, in terms of professionals, in terms of consultants, who are your sort of first people you speak to on a large piece of land? Is it the highways? Is it the drainage? What sort of professionals are you speaking to straight away to get a sort of clear answer as to whether this is a doable site?
The two hardest, the first two questions we always ask, once we've got something we think can work in policy terms, the two technical questions we always ask first are, can we access it? Can we get in it? And how do we drain it? Because they're the two areas where sometimes you do need third-party land. Access we all know about. Surface water drainage is increasingly becoming a challenge because we're increasingly being pushed to put that into watercourses. And you get into all sorts of sort of slightly arcane legal debates then about, having the right to requisition the route of the sewer, but not the right of discharge into a watercourse and all that sort of stuff. And so they're always the first two checks. Once we've got that and we know that something is deliverable, the next stage is then usually to decide who we're going to use for the master planning work. So we can work with them in agreeing what constraints we need to understand and identify, and also give them some time to sort of absorb the site and reflect on the opportunities it presents. I think if you just get all the baseline data together on all the constraints and send it out to an architect and say, here you go, can we open layout by the end? It doesn't matter how talented they are, they're not going to do as good a job as if they've had some time to think about the site and really get to know it and really get under the skin of it.
For sure, yeah, they are complex. I've worked with a few different sets of consultants from people around sort of companies around the northwest, and it's Yeah, I've definitely, when you put pressure on it, it's very easy to get a site, yourself and say, oh, get a feasibility study done. What can you get on this kind of thing? And people expect it. Well, a lot of the architects are like, oh, I need some time. I think when I look at sites, it's like, you want it obviously tomorrow, but then you take a step back and it's actually, are you going to get the best quality design or the best sort of proposal really for the scheme in a week or 2 weeks? It's just not going to happen. You've got to give it that time. You've got to work with the right guys who, like you said, get to know the site and bought into the vision, because ultimately that's how you get the best design for, I guess, the land itself and sale moving forward. But in terms of the housing crisis, Paul, which I guess there's always different opinions of where we're up to with that in terms of the amount of homes that we need to get built. And in terms of working with like the local authorities, I mean, is there anything that you feel that could be done a lot more better in terms of identifying the green belt and brownfield sites, which I guess can improve and speed up the process of getting the houses built? Because I think in Manchester, more than most places, there is obviously that housing crisis in terms of, I guess, family homes and the need for that family home. But what sort of things would you recommend to them right now? I guess with COVID going on, is there anything that post-COVID that you say, look, guys, this is what I sort of recommend to speed up that process, or are you quite happy with the way things are going right now?
Oh, that's a can of worms you've just opened, isn't it? We are clearly not building enough homes. That's pretty much indisputable. There was a recent estimate. The BBC did a really good briefing document on the housing crisis back in, I think it was February, and they summarised various different estimates of the shortfall in new homes. But they concluded that the central estimate figure is that we're about 1.2 million homes short, which is an enormous number, especially when you put it in the context of, we're delivering something in the order of 200 to 250,000 new dwellings per annum into the supply. So just to catch up that 1.2 million is 4 or 5 years before we even start thinking about the homes we should have delivered in those 4 or 5 years to avoid falling behind further.
Crazy, isn't it?
So we're miles behind the curve in terms of the quantity. And there are a whole range of reasons for that. Things like, we make decisions on planning applications at a very local level, and that is precisely the level at which the planning system is about weighing up harms and benefits at its heart, and the local level is where the harms are usually greatest and most immediate, and the benefits tend to occur more slowly and over a wider area. So the harm may be a loss of a view or construction traffic rumbling past your front door, and that happens on day one. The benefit might be, the provision of more affordable housing, or a general sort of amelioration of the house price rises. Well, that takes time, and actually the people that benefit from that don't necessarily live on the street right next door to the site straight away. So there's a real mismatch there. And those sorts of tensions then flow into what really the crux of the problem is that there is simply not enough land available for development. And the planning system is trying to achieve two things at once. It's trying to make sure enough new homes are built, enough new homes of the right quality are built, but it's also trying to protect land from development, if protect is the right word in that context. It's the one everybody always uses, but to try and stop development taking place on land where it's not needed. So the way it does that is it, first of all, estimates how many homes are going to be needed over a 15-year period. Well, and then once it's got that estimate, it identifies the land on which those homes can be delivered. And if you start unpackaging that, estimating the homes you need in 15 years' time, it's impossible. And you see estimates in local plans that say things like, we need 1,487 dwellings per annum. 487, that precise. You can forecast that precisely how many homes you're going to need in 15 years' time. It's a nonsense. And we all sort of know it's a nonsense. But once these figures are calculated, they assume like almost a totemic importance within the system, and we're all deferential at to whatever the figure is, and the whole system is built around that. But it means there is a lack of flexibility built into the system from day one. And then compounding that is because of all these political pressures to actually to minimise the amount of land that is made available for development, that the entirely rational, logical thing for local authorities to do is to allocate the minimum amount of land possible to build those homes. So they put a teaspoon's worth more land in the supply than is needed to deliver that figure. And where that becomes difficult is we know evidentially that something in the order of 10 to 20% of planning permissions are never built. We know that some of those sites will not come forwards, and yet the system doesn't really take that into account. So, and there's a whole range of reasons why sites don't come forward, from landowners changing their mind or technical issues coming up that weren't anticipated, or the uses being built on them. There was a period probably 15 years ago where housing sites were being bought by supermarkets and having new supermarkets built on them, and those homes are just lost from the supply forever then.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole range of reasons, but when you've got such an inflexible supply to begin with, actually losing anything from that supply over a 15-year period means you're not going to hit the target. So you've got a system that is built on a fallacious estimate of what the housing requirement is in the first place, followed by trying to achieve that figure and not a dwelling more. Despite the planning policy saying you can plan for more than your minimum requirement, few authorities do. And you take the two together, and it's no surprise that we're not delivering the number of homes we need across the country as a whole. So, I think when you look at it like that, we do need to do something about it. And, we've had a generation really now of not building enough homes, and various different government initiatives to try and boost supply. And they've worked to varying degrees, because we're adding more new homes to the supply now than we have done at any point since the 1980s. But if we're going to get to the 300,000 homes a year that the government aspires to, and we're going to eat into that 1.2 million home shortfall, we can't keep doing what we've been doing.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree. I think it's, when I've dealt with planners and local authorities, it's, I won't delve too much into it, but it's political in many ways. In terms of on that, modular, of course, is quite a hot topic. Do you think modular can play a part in helping speed up that process, or do you think it's got to start from the root and get those changes done at the early stages?
Different methods of construction can bring lots of different benefits to the supply, but fundamentally, if the land isn't there in the first place, it doesn't matter how you build homes.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to have the land to build them on. And there are lots of advantages to modular about speed of build and quality and that type of thing. And they're all important things. But if there isn't enough land there in the first place, it's kind of irrelevant. And I think, that it's an interesting point in a slightly different context, though, insofar as, developers are often being pushed to use modern methods of construction. And the major PLCs are pretty much reluctant to do it. I know some do to varying degrees. I think Barratt have got a timber frame factory, for instance, that they use for some of their properties. Usually in any industry, the people that are the disruptors and that bring in new methods of production aren't the established major players. It's usually SMEs that come up with new ways of doing things, because they are more flexible. They've got less to lose and more to gain by being disruptive. And when you constrain the land supply to the degree that it has been, it's those SMEs that get squeezed out. Mm-hmm. Because the cost of acquiring the land is pushed up, the cost of securing planning permission on it is pushed up, and SMEs don't have the balance sheet to carry that, to take that risk a lot of the time. So when you're squeezing them out, you're also squeezing out innovation in construction methods. You're also squeezing out innovation in design. The major PLCs get a lot of criticism for the quality of developments they deliver. And there's a really interesting debate as to how misplaced or otherwise that criticism is, which is a separate discussion. But at the moment, there's actually little incentive for them to try and work really, really hard on delivering high quality design. When you ration land supply tightly, the consequence is that those developers are competing on location, not quality.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to build a new home, if you want to buy a new home in a particular town, usually you've only got one choice. And if you like it, you'll buy it. And if you don't, you won't. If you've got more land available and you've got 2 or 3 developments, and one of them is being built out by an SME that's doing something different to how the PLCs would operate, you've got choice then. You can choose not to buy the least attractive home.
Mm-hmm.
And that in and of itself will help drive up build quality, because developers do respond to that sort of pressure. We've seen it. I've seen it happen when I was at TW post financial crash, when all the sort of individual investors disappeared out of the market, and we were redesigning schemes to make them more attractive to owner occupiers. The investors didn't matter so much. They just did a spreadsheet based calculation of number of bedrooms and what rental income they could get for it. If you're buying it to live in, you do think about the practicalities of, can you carry your shopping from your parking space to your front door? Mm-hmm. And are you going to get sunlight in your back garden, and all those sorts of things? So we know that they'll respond to that. And we're seeing a little bit of it already with, the changes that have been introduced since 2012, and that have increased the supply of land to a degree. We've seen, mentioning Barratt again, but Barratt used the Building for Life 12 assessment to measure the quality of all of their schemes before they put planning applications in, just to make sure that they're delivering quality design. So we know it works. So I think that's one of the sort of fringe benefits of making more land available, actually, that is something that more people would appreciate if it were happening, that we get these higher quality schemes as well as a high number of homes. And fundamentally, if the planning system isn't building the right quantity and the right quality of homes, then it's not failing, then it's not achieving what it sets out to achieve. And it's not really doing at the moment.
For sure. I mean, I've worked with a lot of developers, house builders, and sort of your bigger developers that work on the city centre schemes, and you can definitely see if there's no incentives there for them to create the quality design. I mean, it's just a numbers game. As long as they're satisfactory for many, then, especially in the centre of Manchester and the centre of Birmingham, and I guess sort of these buy-to-let areas for the overseas market, they're just churning them out. I mean, there's no real, I mean, of course, they've got to obviously hit a certain standard, of course, but I mean, you can see it in some of the large schemes where you've got 600-700 apartments. It's just, if you actually go to the design, it's not actually that great. But you obviously see that they're doing it for a reason. And if there's no incentives there, then I guess you can't really change that, can you? But something which obviously you do on a day-to-day basis, Paul, is obviously work with vendors and obviously taking the sites through planning. And I mean, as you can imagine, we've talked about before with how complex planning applications are and getting the consent. And like you said, it can be a few years before you get a consent on a site. It's not an easy thing. I mean, what day-to-day wise, Paul, gives you the most hassle? Is it working with the consultants? Is it working with the vendor itself? Or is it finding the actual opportunity that can deliver on?
It gives me the most hassle. I'm not sure I'd characterise it as a hassle, but the biggest challenges are usually those to do with the planning system and the local plan process. And I emphasise the word process in there, because just like when I was talking about some of the shortcomings of the planning system earlier, these are systemic issues most of the time. It's not the individuals that are operating within those systems who, 90% of the time are trying to do the very best they can and do actually want to try and deliver developments and change and improve places. But there are some systemic issues where, you'll have seen this, but where you get mutually contradictory consultation responses to planning applications. And you think, well, how are we supposed to square that particular circle?
Yeah.
Somebody says, well, you need to have your sewers running in this direction. And somebody else says, well, you can't do that because we want houses in that particular location. And it's all those sorts of little problem solving exercises, really. Planning applications usually stand or fall on the details. The minute details of the schemes that only crop up when you pore over things in, with a fine tooth comb, and it's in those details, I think, that the challenges arise. That trying to make sure that everything fits together, everything works together, and that what comes out of it as a consequence is a development that can practically function, as well as something that ticks all the other boxes and is attractive and achieves all of those other sort of really important goals and objectives. So it's usually in that, because you get, coming back to the sort of silo mentality we talked about at the beginning, you get people from lots of different disciplines who all who can have the tendency to think that their discipline is the most important one, and trying to balance all of those things up to get a good answer. A bit like being the conductor of an orchestra, I think, isn't it? You've got all these people playing their own different instruments, and your role as the developer is to turn it into a symphony.
Exactly, it sure is, and I think that's what I've realised as well. I mean, property is a people's business. It sounds quite cliche and simple, but it is really just being able to get on with people and get exactly what you want out of them. Because it's, especially as a developer, as someone like in your position as well, Paul, you've got to make sure that everyone's, like I said, bought into what you want to try and achieve. And if there's any bickering, if there's any sort of time wasted, it can cost a lot of money. So I appreciate that. I think moving on from that, I mean, hopefully with COVID, there's some positive changes with the planning policy and how everything's done in terms of committee and virtual committees. I mean, in terms of obviously something which I'm interested in, I've had to do a few changes personally with my business in terms of, there's positive changes, of course, but in terms of obviously with you guys internally moving forward, obviously I know you said you were quite quick to obviously work from home. Is there going to be any changes moving forward for business-wise that you're going to slightly change, that you can see those an opportunity now to utilise?
I mean, from a very practical point of view, I can see that we'll carry on working from home more often, even once we start sort of getting back to a bit more of a normal world. Because it does, I'm not sure I'd want to do it every day, and especially not with these bright red walls I've got to stare at. But doing it occasionally, being in a different environment, you do think about things in a different way, I think. You get, somehow there are fewer distractions. You don't get, when you've only got your mobile, you don't get the same number of sales calls, do you? Mm-hmm. That can suck up your attention, and you do think about things differently, and it does give you a bit more headspace to reflect on projects and how to get the best out of them. So I can see that being the case. In terms of sort of business strategy and business approach, I'm not sure that there will be that much of a change in what we do, to be honest. Fundamentally, the supply and the balance of, or the imbalance of supply and demand in the housing market is pretty severe, and I can see that staying. And that will stay. So the fundamentals of what we do as a business are going to be sound. We're working on things on a very long-term basis. So, when a local plan is supposed to last for a 15-year period, even a 2 or 3 year hiatus isn't going to impact on whether projects delivered, just on the timing of it. I think the main difference will be just making sure we are alert and mindful to any changes to the planning system that flow through as a result. And, we talked about how land supply is important. And I know that's something that the government is thinking about for their housing white paper that was due in the spring, but I understand is now going to be pushed back until the autumn. But there will be other things as well about, trying to make sure we respond to the design agenda, and we're mindful of how our projects need to adapt to that. And I'm really fascinated to see two things really, and how they pan out. First is to do with our perception of what is an appropriate home and how much lockdown might have changed that. Because the phrase I always use to describe it is that not everybody's lockdown is created equal. Mm-hmm. And much better to be like me, locked down in a semi-detached house in a nice suburb of Manchester with a back garden, than in a small city centre apartment without any outdoor space at all up on the 15th floor or whatever it might be. And the planning system has very much pushed house building into delivering high-rise apartments, in part because of a reluctance to release edge of settlement, greenfield and greenbelt sites for development for all the reasons we've talked about. And I wonder whether or not we might see some rebalancing of that we might think again about what the right mix of homes that we deliver is, whether we should be actually going to deliver more larger family homes. And that's always been a challenge for me. I'm just in the middle of reading a book called The Rebuilding of Manchester, which was published in 1935
Wow.
by a guy called, I can't remember his first name, Sir Ernest Simon, who was the Lord Mayor of Manchester in 1921. And even in his book, he talks about trying to balance up, should they be delivering apartments or should they be delivering cottages in the suburbs for people to live in? And
Wow. 100 years on, we're still not cracked it, eh?
yeah, it's a really interesting book, actually, because so much of it, you could just change the dates and it still applies today.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
And it predates the planning system as we know it as well, which I also find fascinating, that we're still having the same issues despite that. But that's one thing to look at, whether or not how we think about our homes changes and whether we need to change what we do in terms of the types of sites and then the types of layout on those sites that we progress as a result. And the second thing is the whole active travel agenda, and the fact that people are walking and cycling more. I was reading yesterday that 35% of journeys in Greater Manchester are now on foot or by car.
Wow.
Which is a huge number. And there was already a massive proportion of trips in Greater Manchester that were of car journeys in Greater Manchester that were of less than 1 kilometre. It's 30%, according to a GMCA survey. 30% of car journeys of less than 1 kilometre are currently made by car. It's bonkers. It's a 15-minute walk, less than a 15-minute walk, and yet people are getting in the car for it. And I think we're seeing less of that, and we're starting to see changes to highways infrastructure as a consequence. They announced last week, I think it wasn't it, the temporary pedestrianisation of the top end of Deansgate.
Yeah, I saw that, the report on that, yeah.
Yeah, and then yesterday they announced another £5 million of funding for walking and cycling improvements across Greater Manchester, which some of that is Chris Borbin's Beeline's work that's being accelerated, but some of it's new stuff as well. I'm really interested to see how those changes get locked in, because we know that active travel agenda was one that was already being pushed because of the air quality benefits and the health benefits and the climate change benefits that it can produce. So it was already starting to go, but we've all spent the last 7 weeks living in an experiment of what it's like to have less cars on the road. And it's really nice, isn't it?
It is. It actually really is. There's no traffic ever. It's great. I mean, it's fascinating because I was in Birmingham prior to sort of COVID, and I was meeting with a couple of architects down there, and they were saying how much they're trying to pedestrianise, obviously around New Street and the future of it. And it's just it makes so much sense. I think especially for places like Deansgate in Manchester and key parts of the city centre. Of course, it's a step-by-step process. It's never going to happen straight away. It's not going to, it's like with the local authorities and planning. It's never going to be a quick win process. But I think it's the future. I think, as we've seen, Deansgate, a few of my friends I've got a lady who works in the environmental sector, essentially. She works now for Qatar Airways, and she was saying Deansgate is in the northwest, like one of the most polluted streets in the whole of northwest. And I was like, my office is in Spinningfields next to 20 stories. So I walk there every day, and it's crazy to think that I'm walking down near one of the most polluted streets in the whole of sort of the northwest, really. So I think there is, for many benefits, that it's where the future is at.
And it might start out as a temporary change, but
exactly
the thing is about temporary changes is that temporary changes introduced in a crisis have a habit of sticking around. And the best example of that is income tax. Which was a temporary tax introduced to help fund the Napoleonic Wars. Over 200 years later, it's still here and we're all still paying it. And that's because sometimes you introduce something that's temporary and it actually turns out to be a really good idea. And I think these active travel changes are likely to fall into that category. And that has all sorts of consequences for when you're thinking about development design. And how you incorporate really good high quality cycle infrastructure, for instance, that does segregate bikes from people and cars. One of the reasons cyclists get so much stick, I think, is they're actually the only form of transport that doesn't have its own space. Mm-hmm. If you're a pedestrian, you've got the pavement. If you're a car, you've got the road. If you're on a bike, you're sharing it with one or the other of them.
Exactly.
But what Chris Borbin's trying to do with these segregated cycle lanes and making it feel much safer to ride your bike is an incredible thing. And when we're seeing some of that coming in temporarily, when people are getting more used to it, more people are buying bikes. You see photos on social media, don't you, of people queuing around the block at bike shops.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that being a change that sticks, and that will have a profound impact, I think, on how we think about housing design and how we think about development in general. Because if you are cycling more, if people are more inclined to walk and cycle, then you start using services and facilities that are more local. And you see some of the work that's being done in Europe, like in Paris, for instance, where the mayor has got this objective to deliver what they call a 15-minute city, where everything you need can be reached within a 15-minute walk or bike ride from where you live. And you can see those sorts of approaches, having a big impact on what sorts of development work in what sorts of locations.
Makes complete sense. I think I'm big believer in it as to where I guess it's going to head for the local sort of development frameworks, and I'm excited in many ways. And I think this, like you said, the COVID has allowed us to be in a position where we are going to try new things. We are going to do a lot more cycling. I mean, I had to pick up a new bike last week, and I was outside Halfords for an hour and a half. It's crazy demand for bikes, and it's just never seen it before. So, but I guess that's a positive, and I guess it's going to be moving forward in the right way. So, something which you wanted to move on to, Paul. I mean, I'm a big believer in personal development myself. I mean, it's slightly outside of property. I mean, you mentioned that you're reading a book on sort of, I guess it was the regeneration of Manchester, was it, from quite some time ago? What's your personal development sort of time, day to day like? Do you listen to podcasts? Do you listen to audio books? Or do you read sort of fiction, non-fiction books? I'm always interested to see what, I guess, the leaders in our space are doing in the spare time, really.
I do all of those things. I love learning, and I love finding out new stuff about anything. So I actually sat at my desk now, and I've got a box of books sat next to me that are things I've been working through. So, the rebuilding of Manchester that I mentioned from 1935, but then also in it is Street Fight, which is Jeanette Sadiq Khan's book about active travel and what she changed when she was the Transport Commissioner in New York. I've got a book about the history of the economic development of Chicago, and how that grew up from being nowhere to being the second biggest metropolis in the US at one point. But then I listen to podcasts as well. When I was out running yesterday, I always like listening to a podcast when I'm running to try and distract myself from the fact that I've got however many more minutes to be going for. But then I really like reading. I really like reading fiction books as well. All sorts of stuff from modern literature. I know there's an adaptation of Normal People, isn't there, that's on the TV at the moment, but that Sally Rooney book was a really good one that I enjoyed reading. And older stuff as well, things like, my favourite book ever that I read quite often is Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis. It just makes me laugh out loud every time I read it. So yeah, all sorts of stuff, because I think, it comes back to this breadth point, that learning about things that are outside of your core competence or one step removed from it can give you a different perspective on what you do day to day, and can make you better at it. Yes, there is absolutely a place for learning lots about the things that you do on a day-to-day basis and your particular specialism and expertise. But I also think it's really important that you're learning about other things around that, so you can keep that context, so you can challenge yourself to have different ways of thinking about the world and looking at the world.
For sure. It's definitely different perspectives, isn't it? I think it's, like you said, it's pulling, like people say, golden nuggets out of different books, different podcasts that may not be sort of right straight away that you can apply to your business or can apply to your life. But those ideas, when you start connecting the dots and you broaden your horizon in terms of knowledge and perspectives, it massively helps. And I think if you do that on a consistent basis for years and years, it shows, doesn't it? I guess in the conversations that you have with people and sort of the work that you do. I mean, something that we want to round off with, Paul. I mean, we always, as a tradition, round off the podcast with your best quote and your best coffee. I mean, of course, if you drink herbal tea or any sort of teas, that's absolutely fine as well. But if you have a quote that you live by every single day, Paul, and maybe you sort of go to coffee to get you going, or some tea or whatever that would be, what would those two things be?
Well, my coffee that's an easy one, because all I ever drink is espresso. So a double if I can get it, but sometimes shops can be a bit sniffy about that, so you can only get a single. So
Yeah.
I chain drink espresso. In fact, when I found out I was going to be a dad, sort of 5 years ago, the first thing I bought was an espresso machine for the kitchen downstairs. So that's had a hammering over the last 4 and a bit years.
Good man.
In terms of a quote, that's a good one. Probably the one that I think really resonates with me at the minute is a quote from a book called Oi Frog, which is a kid's book, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the premise is that animals have to sit on objects that they rhyme with. So frogs sit on logs, for instance. They can't sit on a chair. And there's a section in that where the cat says to the frog, "It's not about being comfortable. It's about doing the right thing." And I think that's a pretty good philosophy for life. We should always do the thing that we're comfortable with doing. We should try and focus on doing the thing that we know deep down is actually the right thing to do. And if we keep doing that often enough, then you get to a better place, don't you?
For sure. I think like morally, you feel when you do the right thing for people, business wise, or just giving back, it makes a lot of sense day to day, and it's I completely agree. It's a good way of living your life. But Paul, no, I really appreciate you coming on this morning. I think it's definitely I've personally learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners that are going to be listening to it will have learned a lot as well. I'm sure once it all gets back to normal, we'll definitely grab a coffee and we'll go through some things and maybe get another episode done, which would be great. But yeah, no, Paul, that'll be great. The Best in Property podcast with Paul Smith, and looking forward to hearing it.
Thanks a lot, Jake. Really good talking to you. Take care. Bye now.